put your phone or device aside and immerse yourself in this audio story. Perfect for listening on the move, while relaxing, or for bedtime listening. We release new stories daily, so make sure to like and subscribe to not miss out. This story is based on true events. The Paper Empire. In April 2016, a single email changed everything. Inside the servers of a small Panamanian law firm called Mossack Fonseca, 11.5 million documents sat waiting in the darkness. A digital archive of secrets that kings, criminals, presidents, and billionaires had paid fortunes to keep buried. When an anonymous whistleblower known only as John Doe sent those files to a German newspaper, they unleashed the largest data leak in history. A dark business story that would expose how the world's elite had been hiding trillions of dollars in an invisible empire built on paper, silence, and one simple truth. The best way to disappear your money is to make the owner disappear first. But here's what most people don't know. Mossack Fonseca wasn't some rogue operation. It was the architect of a global system so perfectly legal, so elegantly designed, that it allowed dictators, drug lords, and respectable businessmen to share the same secret corridors of wealth. This is the story of the Panama Papers, a business thriller about the invisible companies that rule our world. The two lawyers who built an empire from shadows, and the question nobody wanted answered. If you can make ownership itself disappear, what else vanishes with it? The firm of Mossack Fonseca opened its doors in Panama City in 1977, founded by Jürgen Mossack, a German immigrant with wire-rimmed glasses and an accountant's careful demeanor, and Ramon Fonseca Mora, a charismatic Panamanian novelist turned lawyer, with political connections that ran deep into the country's power structure. On the surface, they sold corporate services, helping international clients establish offshore companies in jurisdictions with favorable tax laws. But what they really sold was something far more valuable in the world of wealth and power: invisibility. Their product was the shell company, a legal entity that exists only on paper, registered in a foreign country, with nominee directors whose names appear on documents, while the real owners remain hidden behind layers of legal fog. These weren't just tax shelters. They were financial ghost ships, sailing through the global economy with no captain's name on the hull, carrying cargo nobody could inspect, bound for destinations that didn't appear on any map. Panama had positioned itself perfectly for this dark business model. The country offered strict corporate secrecy laws, no requirement to disclose beneficial ownership, minimal government oversight, and a corporate registry that asked almost no questions. For a few $1,000s, anyone could purchase a ready-made company, complete with nominee directors, a registered address, and absolute anonymity. Mossack and Fonseca understood the psychology of wealth in a way most lawyers never would. They knew that the richest people in the world don't just want to protect their money. They want to separate themselves from it entirely, to create a space where their wealth exists independent of their identity, free from the scrutiny of governments, journalists, ex-spouses, and the public eye. The firm grew quietly but relentlessly, opening offices in Hong Kong, Miami, Zurich, and London. They established relationships with banks, accountants, and lawyers in every major financial center, creating a global network that could move money across borders with the efficiency of a multinational corporation and the discretion of a secret society. By the early 2000s, Mossack Fonseca had become the fourth largest offshore law firm in the world, with more than 600 employees and over 14,000 shell companies under management. Their client list read like a directory of global power: politicians who needed to hide conflicts of interest, businessmen evading sanctions, celebrities protecting their wealth from publicity, and criminals laundering the proceeds of drug trafficking, arms dealing, and corruption. The beauty of the system was its ambiguity. Shell companies themselves aren't illegal. Corporations use them legitimately for international business, asset protection, and estate planning. But Mossack Fonseca had built their empire in the gray zone between legal and criminal, providing a service that was technically permissible, while knowing full well that many clients were using it for purposes that were anything but. Internal emails that would later surface showed employees discussing clients with obvious red flags, politically exposed persons from countries known for corruption, individuals on sanctions lists, companies with no clear business purpose beyond holding assets. The firm developed procedures that looked like due diligence, but functioned more like plausible deniability. They would ask clients for identification and references, but if those documents seemed suspicious, they rarely pushed harder. The business model depended on not looking too closely. The firm's files revealed the true scope of this invisible empire. There was Sigmundur David Gunnlaugsson, the Prime Minister of Iceland, who had secretly held millions in Icelandic bank bonds through a shell company while publicly making decisions about those very banks' bankruptcy proceedings. There was Nawaz Sharif, Pakistan's Prime Minister, whose children owned luxury London properties through offshore entities that couldn't be traced back to the family. There were 12 current or former world leaders, including the President of Ukraine, the King of Saudi Arabia, and the President of Argentina, all using Mossack Fonseca's shell companies to hide wealth that raised uncomfortable questions about corruption and conflicts of interest. But perhaps most revealing were the criminals who had found shelter in this system. The firm had created companies for associates of Rami Makhlouf, a Syrian businessman and cousin of dictator Bashar al-Assad, helping the regime hide assets while Syria descended into civil war. They'd worked with representatives of North Korea, helping the sanctioned regime access the international financial system. They'd established companies for Mexican drug cartels looking to launder narcotics money, for Russian oligarchs hiding wealth stolen from the state, for Iranian entities evading international sanctions. But here's where this dark business story takes its first devastating turn, one that reveals the true genius of Mossack Fonseca's business model. The firm didn't just create shell companies. They created shell companies that owned other shell companies, which owned other shell companies, building ownership structures so complex that even sophisticated law enforcement agencies couldn't untangle them. A single client might have a British Virgin Islands company owned by a Panamanian foundation, controlled by a Seychelles trust, with nominee directors from 3 different countries, and a Swiss bank account attached to an entity registered in the Bahamas. Investigators called these structures Russian dolls, nested layers of corporate entities, each one adding another degree of separation between the money and its real owner. The psychological brilliance was that each layer felt legitimate in isolation. Any single shell company could be explained away as normal business practice, but stacked together, they created an architecture of invisibility that turned the global financial system into a house of mirrors where nothing was quite what it seemed. And the most chilling part? This wasn't some underground operation. Mossack Fonseca worked openly with some of the world's largest banks: HSBC, Credit Suisse, UBS, Deutsche Bank, who referred wealthy clients to the firm and processed the transactions that flowed through these phantom companies. The invisible empire existed in plain sight, hidden not by secrecy, but by complexity, protected not by criminal conspiracy, but by the willful blindness of a financial system that profited from not asking questions. Inside Mossack Fonseca's offices, the human cost of this business model was invisible. Employees processed paperwork for shell companies the way factory workers assembled widgets, with efficiency, professionalism, and minimal curiosity about the final product's purpose. The firm had industrialized secrecy, turning the creation of anonymous entities into a repeatable, scalable business process. They offered shelf companies, pre-registered entities sitting ready for purchase, like products on a warehouse shelf, complete with generic names that suggested legitimate businesses: Greenwood Holdings, Pacific Consulting Group, Atlantic Investment Corporation. For an additional fee, they would backdate documents, creating a fictional corporate history that made newly purchased companies appear to have existed for years. They would provide mail forwarding services so that official correspondence to a shell company's registered address would be screened and forwarded only if appropriate, ensuring that nominee directors never saw anything that might make them uncomfortable about their role in the structure. The firm's partners, Mossack and Fonseca, presented themselves as respectable businessmen operating within the bounds of law. Fonseca, the more public-facing partner, was a published novelist who had served as a counselor to Panama's president. He spoke eloquently about financial privacy as a human right, comparing their work to doctor-patient confidentiality and attorney-client privilege. In interviews, he would argue that wealthy people had every right to protect their assets from excessive taxation and frivolous lawsuits, that their firm simply provided legal services in a competitive global marketplace. But internal communications told a different story, one of a firm that knew exactly what many of their clients were doing and chose profit over principle. When compliance officers raised red flags about suspicious clients, senior partners often overruled them. When banks requested additional documentation for due diligence, the firm sometimes provided the minimum required while quietly advising clients on how to satisfy these requests without revealing true ownership. They had created a machine for making ownership disappear, and that machine ran on a simple fuel: the willingness to serve anyone who could pay, and the determination to never look too closely at where the money came from or where it was going. The scale of this invisible empire was staggering. By 2015, Mossack Fonseca had created more than 214,000 shell companies since its founding, a corporate army large enough to populate a mid-sized city, each entity existing solely on paper, but wielding real power in the physical world. These companies owned penthouses in Manhattan, yachts in the Mediterranean, private jets, art collections, and entire commercial real estate portfolios. They held bank accounts containing billions of dollars that flowed through the global economy invisibly, buying political influence, laundering criminal proceeds, evading taxes that should have funded schools and hospitals. The firm had unwittingly become the record keeper for a shadow economy that operated parallel to the legitimate financial system. A dark business empire where the normal rules of transparency, taxation, and accountability simply didn't apply. And because each shell company was technically legal in isolation, and because the firm operated in jurisdictions with weak oversight and strong secrecy protections, this entire system flourished in a legal gray zone that made prosecution almost impossible. But in 2015, someone inside this machine decided to break it open. A person with access to Mossack Fonseca's internal servers, their identity still unknown today, began copying files. Not just a few suspicious documents, but everything. Client records, internal emails, corporate registrations, bank records, passport copies, financial statements, and correspondence spanning 4 decades. The scale of the theft was unprecedented: 2.6 terabytes of data, more information than had been leaked in the Pentagon Papers, the WikiLeaks cables, and the Edward Snowden revelations combined. The whistleblower, using only the pseudonym John Doe, contacted a reporter at the German newspaper Süddeutsche Zeitung with a message that read like something from a business thriller. "Hello, this is John Doe. Interested in data? I share your concerns about the state of journalism and have information to share." What followed was the largest journalism collaboration in history. Over 400 reporters from 107 media organizations in 80 countries, working in secret for a year to analyze the documents and verify their authenticity. And here's what makes this moment so psychologically devastating for everyone involved in the offshore system. The leak didn't happen because of sophisticated hacking or government surveillance. It happened because someone inside the machine, someone who saw the daily reality of what these shell companies enabled, decided that the world deserved to know the truth. The invisible empire's greatest vulnerability wasn't external law enforcement or regulatory oversight. It was the possibility that someone with access would develop a conscience. On April 3, 2016, news organizations around the world simultaneously published their findings from the Panama Papers. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. In Iceland, tens of thousands of citizens took to the streets demanding the resignation of Prime Minister Gunnlaugsson, who stepped down within days. The first world leader, toppled by the revelations. In the United Kingdom, Prime Minister David Cameron faced intense questioning about his late father's offshore investment fund, eventually admitting he had benefited from shares in the company before becoming Prime Minister. In Spain, the industry minister resigned after being implicated in the papers. In Pakistan, Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif would eventually be disqualified from office by the Supreme Court over corruption questions raised by his family's offshore holdings. But the true revelation wasn't about any single politician or criminal. It was about the system itself. The exposure of a global infrastructure that allowed wealth and power to operate in darkness, beyond the reach of democratic accountability or legal oversight. The Panama Papers revealed that the world's financial system wasn't just occasionally abused by bad actors. It had been specifically designed to enable this abuse, with law firms like Mossack Fonseca serving as the architects, banks serving as the infrastructure, and secrecy jurisdictions serving as the legal foundation. Mossack Fonseca's response to the exposure followed a predictable pattern of denial and deflection. They claimed they were victims of a hack, threatened legal action against news organizations, and insisted they had always operated within the bounds of law. Ramon Fonseca gave interviews portraying the firm as scapegoats for a global system they didn't create, arguing that they merely provided legal services that were available from hundreds of other firms around the world. And technically, he was right. Mossack Fonseca was just one firm among many in the offshore industry. And Panama was just one secrecy jurisdiction competing with the British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, Delaware, and dozens of other locations that offered similar services. But that defense only made the revelation more disturbing. If Mossack Fonseca was just one firm among many, if this system was replicated in financial centers across the globe, then the Panama Papers hadn't exposed a scandal. They'd exposed the normal functioning of international finance. The invisible empire wasn't an aberration. It was how the system was designed to work. The firm tried to continue operations after the leak, but the damage was irreparable. Clients fled, banks severed relationships, and law enforcement agencies in multiple countries opened investigations. In March 2018, Mossack Fonseca announced it was shutting down, citing reputational deterioration and the economic and business impact of the scandal. The two founding partners faced criminal charges in Panama for money laundering, though both denied wrongdoing and argued they were being prosecuted for providing legal services. Jürgen Mossack died in 2023 while still awaiting trial, taking whatever psychological justifications he had for building this empire to his grave. But the closure of one law firm didn't dismantle the system it had helped create. The demand for offshore secrecy didn't disappear. It simply migrated to other providers, other jurisdictions, new structures that learned from Mossack Fonseca's mistakes about digital security and internal controls. The Panama Papers had exposed the architecture of the invisible empire, but they hadn't destroyed its foundation. The business lessons embedded in this dark story cut to the heart of how power and wealth actually operate in the modern world. Mossack Fonseca had built a business model on a simple insight. The greatest luxury the rich can buy isn't property or possessions, it's invisibility. In a world of surveillance, transparency requirements, and public scrutiny, the ability to separate yourself from your wealth, to make ownership itself disappear behind layers of corporate entities and nominee directors, becomes the ultimate form of power. The firm had industrialized a service that previously required extensive legal expertise and high-level connections, making anonymous ownership available at scale. They'd built a machine that ran on legal ambiguity, operating in the space between legitimate business practice and criminal conspiracy, providing services that were defensible in isolation, but devastating in aggregate. Their growth strategy relied on network effects. Every bank that referred clients, every lawyer who recommended their services, every accountant who structured deals using their entities made the system more valuable and more difficult to challenge. But the Panama Papers also revealed the fundamental fragility of systems built on secrecy. For 40 years, Mossack Fonseca's business model depended on information never escaping their control. They'd built legal and technical systems to protect client confidentiality, but they'd failed to account for the human element, the possibility that someone with access would decide that transparency mattered more than profit. The whistleblower John Doe later published a manifesto explaining the decision to leak the documents, writing, "Income inequality is one of the defining issues of our time. It affects all of us, the world over." The prevailing media narrative depicts inequality as a natural consequence of free markets. But what the Panama Papers really show is that the system is rigged. That moral dimension, the growing conviction among insiders that the system they served was fundamentally unjust, proved to be the real threat to the offshore industry. You can build legal protections, you can encrypt servers, you can structure ownership across multiple jurisdictions, but you can't completely eliminate the risk that someone will develop a conscience. The global response to the Panama Papers revealed both the power and the limitations of transparency. More than 150 tax inquiries were launched worldwide, dozens of countries opened criminal investigations, and governments collectively recovered over $1.2 billion in back taxes and penalties from individuals and companies named in the leak. Some jurisdictions implemented new beneficial ownership registries, requiring companies to disclose their real owners. The European Union introduced new anti-money laundering directives with stricter requirements for banks and law firms. But these reforms confronted a stubborn reality. The offshore system exists because powerful people want it to exist, and they have the resources to keep it functioning even under increased scrutiny. Secrecy jurisdictions compete for business by offering ever more sophisticated privacy protections. Law firms and banks develop new structures that comply with the letter of regulations while evading their spirit, and clients simply move their assets to new providers and new jurisdictions that haven't yet faced comparable scrutiny. The Panama Papers didn't end offshore finance. They just made it more expensive and more carefully structured. The human casualties of this system extend far beyond the politicians who resigned or the firm that closed. The Panama Papers documented how shell companies enabled massive corruption that robbed poor countries of resources needed for development, how they facilitated sanctions, evasion by regimes committing human rights abuses, how they helped criminals launder money, while legitimate businesses struggled to comply with increasingly complex regulations. Daphne Caruana Galizia, a Maltese journalist who investigated Panama Papers' connections to her country's government, was assassinated by a car bomb in 2017, a brutal reminder that exposing the invisible empire carried real risks for those without power or protection. The documents revealed that while ordinary citizens paid taxes on their income and saw their governments cut services due to budget shortfalls, the wealthy elite were hiding trillions in offshore accounts, paying minimal taxes while enjoying the infrastructure and security that tax revenue provided. This wasn't just a story about financial crime. It was a story about a fundamental breakdown in the social contract, where the rules applied differently based on your ability to purchase invisibility. What made Mossack Fonseca's business model so psychologically insidious was how it normalized participation in this system. The firm's employees weren't criminal masterminds. They were lawyers, accountants, and administrative staff doing what they believed was legal work within an established industry. The banks that referred clients weren't criminal enterprises. They were respectable financial institutions serving wealthy customers' legal needs. The clients who used shell companies included people with legitimate privacy concerns, alongside those engaged in corruption and crime. The genius of the system was that everyone could tell themselves they were operating within legal bounds, that any illegality was someone else's responsibility, that they were just providing professional services in a competitive marketplace. This diffusion of responsibility, the way that complex systems allow everyone to deny accountability for the whole, is perhaps the darkest lesson of the Panama Papers. It reveals how ordinary people with ordinary ethics can participate in extraordinary injustice simply by focusing on their small role in a larger machine, never stepping back to question what that machine actually does. Today, the offshore industry continues to operate, though with increased caution about security and documentation. Subsequent leaks, the Paradise Papers in 2017, the Pandora Papers in 2021, revealed that the Panama Papers hadn't dismantled the system of offshore secrecy, just exposed one firm's archives. The invisible empire persists because it serves the interests of the powerful, and power protects itself. The lesson for business isn't that offshore structures are inherently wrong. Legitimate uses exist for international corporate entities, but the Panama Papers revealed what happens when an entire industry is built on the principle of deliberate blindness. When asking questions becomes bad business. When the gulf between legal and ethical grows so wide that firms can operate for decades, serving criminals, corrupt politicians, and tax evaders while claiming they're just following the law. In the end, Mossack Fonseca succeeded brilliantly at building what their clients wanted, an empire invisible to scrutiny, where ownership could disappear and accountability could vanish. Their failure was forgetting that in the digital age, no secret is truly permanent, no system is completely secure, and eventually, someone always breaks the silence. The story of the Panama Papers is ultimately a story about what happens when wealth becomes completely separated from responsibility, when the mechanisms of capitalism evolve to serve not productive investment, but pure secrecy, when the infrastructure of global finance is deliberately designed to make the question, who really owns this, impossible to answer. Mossack and Fonseca built a business that generated millions in revenue by helping the world's elite make themselves invisible. And in doing so, they created a perfect documentary record of how that invisibility actually worked, who used it, and what they were hiding. That record, leaked by someone who decided transparency mattered more than complicity, became the most comprehensive exposure of offshore finance ever published. A dark business story that revealed not an aberration, but the normal functioning of a global system built on shadows. The invisible empire fell not because governments finally enforced the law, not because banks stopped serving questionable clients, not because secrecy jurisdictions reformed their regulations, but because someone inside the machine realized that the emperor had no clothes and decided the world deserved to see him naked. The question the Panama Papers force us to confront isn't whether Mossack Fonseca was uniquely corrupt. It's whether a system that allows such firms to operate for decades, serving criminals and dictators alongside respectable clients, represents the kind of capitalism we actually want to live with. And that question, unlike the ownership of a shell company in Panama, cannot be hidden behind layers of legal entities and nominee directors. It demands an answer that's visible to everyone. Subscribe and listen to our next story below.